We are learning new information surrounding what some consider to be one of the CIA's worst failures in recent history.
The Foreign Policy magazine article entitled "Botched CIA Communication System Helped Blow Cover of Chinese Agents" takes a look at how Chinese authorities were able to infiltrate the CIA's network of secret informants.
It also reveals the shocking number of spies who were killed while working in the communist country. Now, investigative journalist Zach Dorfman wrote that article, and he is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Council and joins us now from San Francisco with more on these revelations. And, you know, we use the word assets, but we're talking about human beings with lives working on behalf of the American government in China. So, Zach, before we get into your reporting, I want you to just sort of take us back to the beginning. 2010, what happened?
Well, first, thanks so much for having me. And yes, starting in 2010 and 2011, 2012, the CIA began to notice that many of its human assets, as you mentioned, human beings with families and friends and networks, started to disappear. And eventually, their entire network, or one of their entire networks of sources and assets in China, was completely blown up by the Chinese intelligence services. Prior reporting stated that the total number of assets killed was over a dozen, according to multiple former U.S. intelligence community officials that I spoke with. That number was closer to 30, if not higher.
So explain to our viewers how the Chinese were able to break up the network, how they were able to figure out that there were spies in their midst.
Well, there's 2 points, and they're not mutually exclusive. The first was that in conversations with some of these former officials, a word that kept coming up was hubris. And that is that at the time, in 2010, 2011, the CIA was operating in a country with extraordinarily sophisticated surveillance apparatus on the internet. And the covert communication system that they were using to communicate with these human sources was internet-based. So that's the first thing, was this notion that the CIA believed that its system was secure and that the Chinese intelligence services would not be able to break it. That was incorrect. The second point that I was told, and this is the really key one, is that when CIA officers begin communicating with new assets, they use what's known as the transitional covert communication system. And that's set up in order to establish this communication and to ensure over time that the person that the CIA officer is communicating with is, in fact, not a dangle of the Chinese intelligence services. What occurred was the transitional system was architecturally connected back to the main system where CIA officers speak to vetted sources. So what I was told was that the Chinese intelligence services were able to get their hands on the transitional system, and because of this flaw in the architecture, they were able to break into the main system from that. And from there, they were able to map out the entire CIA network in China.
But this seems so basic that when you have sort of a network, you try to make sure that it's completely sort of enclosed and not connected to other networks, or else precisely what you're describing can happen. I presume that this system of acquiring assets, cultivating them, they've done this other places in other countries. Is this a new loophole, or just one that was kind of like always there, but only the Chinese figured out how to get into it?
Well, I think, you know, the kind of shock about the rudimentary nature of the system that you're describing was shared by some of the former intelligence community officials that I spoke with. I would say that I have been told that in the past these kinds of systems would never have been put in place, and that there would never have been any sharing between the transitional or the main system, or, and this is really important, systems across different countries. And in my reporting, what I was told was that this system was imported, in fact, from war zones in the Middle East, most likely Syria and Iraq, where the kind of tactical objectives and the requirements are very, very different than in a surveillance state like the People's Republic of China. And so this was, there was a screw-up of sorts, and a very, very deadly one at that. And there has not been any real adjudication in the public sphere or in the legislature, at least publicly, about what went wrong, why it went wrong, and who might be held responsible for it.
Zach, as you know, when the New York Times first reported the story last year, they put the number of CIA assets, people killed by the Chinese government at more than a dozen. I want to know how many through the course of your investigation did you find? And more importantly, just for our audience to understand, when we talk about these agents, these suspected agents, we're not talking about, you know, I think people, when they think of the CIA or they think of MI6 or any of the intelligence agencies, the Mossad, they imagine these spies that are like James Bond type spies. These are just individuals that happen to be gathering information on behalf of the U.S. government that were presumably Chinese and not Americans or British or Israelis or whatever, that were gathering information at the request of the United States, sharing that information, obviously getting paid for it. But we're not talking about like agents, like CIA agents, are we?
Not at all. We are talking about just individuals, as you said, almost certainly citizens of the People's Republic of China. And, you know, these could be people in positions of, you know, in the intelligence world, what you want is access and placement. So you could have somebody at State Technical Institute, somebody who works in the office of a party functionary or official or regional governor, something like that. These are not spies in the sense of us thinking of CIA officers, individuals who may be accredited to a diplomatic institution in China and are technically State Department employees, but are in fact CIA operatives. These are Chinese nationals who were passing information back to the CIA for various reasons, one of which you mentioned before was financial remuneration. And when the Chinese broke up this network, they started a dragnet and brought people in, imprisoned people. But what I was told, and this is new this was not previously reported, that eventually all of those individuals were executed. And as you mentioned, the initial death toll was hovering around a dozen. I was told roughly 30, and in some conversations I got a significantly higher total as well.
Just out of curiosity, Zach, how long did it take, the Americans to figure out that this was happening? How long were the Chinese, how long did they have access to this system?
Well, I was told by a former intelligence community official that the vulnerability in the firewall between the main covert communication system and the transitional one was only about 6 months, but the Chinese intelligence services managed to break in during this period. As far as how long it took the U.S. to figure out exactly what was going on, it was a matter of months because, you know, in these cases, especially in a place like China where communication between officers and agents is so difficult, sometimes you'll go months without any kind of communication whatsoever between a CIA officer and his or her source. And then also what happened was, you know, once the Chinese intelligence services were able to start mapping out the network of people who are using the covert communication system, they began to figure out that there were people who were not using that system and then wrap them in as well. So this took place over a matter of months, and as the CIA and the U.S. intelligence community began to realize the extent of the damage, there was real fear and all of a sudden this kind of horrific understanding that they had a massive systemic failure on their hands.
And Zach, before we let you go real quickly, you mentioned that there's been no legislative insights or investigation or anything done here in the United States as to the failures of the CIA over the course of this period. Is that because, going back to the point that you were making, that these were Chinese nationals, they're not necessarily American assets, U.S. citizens, they're not covert operatives working directly for the CIA, and so I'm just trying to understand why the American people are not more aware of this, why our elected officials are not doing more to look into the failures of the CIA and to prevent that for the future.
Well, I think that I think that you're absolutely correct that because this was a China-side catastrophe that dealt with the deaths of people who are not American citizens, that probably had something to do with the quiet surrounding it. But even more importantly, it's just that the CIA, approaches its work with extraordinary secrecy, as the world of espionage is by nature secret. And the New York Times story that first uncovered the disruption of this network was 6 or 7 years after it initially occurred. That said, though, I believe that there's probably a good case to be made for why there needs to be some kind of public forum on why what happened in China happened, and who should be held responsible potentially for this catastrophic failure of a rudimentary communication system.
Zach Dorfman, great reporting. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.